Hey guys, tonight we slip back into the streets of ancient Rome, where marble arches glisten in the sun and aqueducts stride across valleys like stone giants, with water coursing through their veins. Imagine the hum of the city, the clatter of sandals on paving stones, the hiss of bakers pulling bread from clay ovens, the shouts of merchants hawking olives and wine, and overhead the endless ribbon of water that makes it all possible. Without aqueducts, Rome would have been thirsty, dirty and cranky. With them it became the envy of the ancient world. You probably won't survive this, at least not if you had to carry all your daily water in clay jars by hand, but since we're only imagining, you'll be just fine. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, post your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how wide this little circle stretches. It feels like our own small empire of listeners. Now find yourself a cosy seat or a soft bed. Let your mind begin to unwind, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins with triumph. Picture a new aqueduct rising over the landscape, each arch stacked with mathematical precision, each stone carefully locked into place. Roman engineers didn't just build pipes, they built monuments to water itself. One mainstream historical fact is that Rome's aqueduct network eventually spanned over 400 kilometres, about 250 miles of channels, tunnels and bridges, delivering millions of gallons of water daily. This particular aqueduct, though, is remembered not for its longevity, but for its sudden and inexplicable failure. It flowed proudly one day only to run dry the next. The inauguration of such a structure was a festival in itself. Senators and magistrates arrived in indigo-trimmed togas, priests scattered incense, and musicians filled the air with horns and drums. The first gush of water into a fountain wasn't just a practical achievement, it was political theatre. Crowds cheered as sparkling streams cascaded into basins carved from marble. The aqueduct symbolised prosperity, power and divine favour. If water was life, then Rome had proven it could command life itself. Children darted near the first fountain, sticking their hands into the spray, shrieking at the shock of cold mountain water. Vendors quickly took advantage, offering cups to thirsty celebrants, charging a few coins for what had just become Rome's freshest luxury. Somewhere in the crowd, a scald-like poet might have jotted lines on a wax tablet, praising the aqueduct as the stone river that never sleeps. Irony would later twist those words into a curse. Even skeptics had to admit that the aqueduct was an impressive feat of design. The channel maintained a gentle gradient no more than a few centimetres of drop per 100 metres, so that water flowed steadily without rushing or stagnating. Quirky fact, Roman engineers sometimes used inverted siphons, giant U-shaped pipes of lead or stone to force water across valleys. They looked like plumbing on steroids, and while effective, they baffled outsiders who assumed Rome had bottled sorcery. But beneath the applause, there were murmurs. Some citizens whispered that the gods might resent Rome's arrogance in dragging water wherever it pleased. Rivers, after all, had their own spirits, and springs were sacred to nymphs. To chain them in stone could be seen as defiance of the divine. Historians still argue whether these fears represented genuine religious resistance, or just the grumbling of traditionalists who disliked seeing old beliefs bent beneath imperial ambition. The aqueduct's first days of operation transformed daily life. Public baths filled with steaming water fountains sparkled in plazas, and private villas advertised their piped-in luxury, like modern houses bragging about swimming pools. Bakers needed less time, fetching water tanners soaked their hides more easily, and ordinary citizens no longer queued at wells for hours. The city hummed with efficiency. The aqueduct had not only changed the skyline but rewired the rhythm of existence. And then, without warning, it failed. One morning citizens arrived at fountains to find them sputtering like sickly lungs. By midday the flow had stopped altogether. The roar of cascading water had been replaced by silence. Children tapped empty basins in confusion while bath attendants stood uselessly beside cold pools. Bakers cursed as their dough went dry. Households that had bragged about running water suddenly lugged jars like everyone else. It was as though Rome itself had hiccuped. The reaction was swift and bewildered. Magistrates summoned engineers to inspect the arches, fearing a collapse, but the stones stood firm, uncracked and unmoved. Workers trudged along the channel, peering into conduits, only to find them bare as a picked bone. No breaks, no sabotage, no floods, just emptiness. Even the cisterns that should have been brimming had gone hollow overnight. It was as if the gods had pinched the river at its source. Rumours spread like wildfire. Some claimed an earthquake had sealed the springs, though no tremors had been felt. Others whispered of divine anger, a punishment for hubris. One soldier swore he saw a raven perched on the aqueduct at dawn, croaking like a herald of doom. A merchant insisted rival cities had secretly diverted the water upstream, a primitive act of espionage that left Rome parched. None of these theories could be proven, but each added fuel to the confusion. The streets themselves became stages for speculation. At taverns, men slapped tables and declared the aqueduct cursed. Women filled buckets at dwindling wells and muttered that Rome had flown too close to the sun like Icarus, only this time with water instead of wax wings. Children dared each other to run along the aqueduct's shadow at night, convinced that spirits walked its length now that the water had fled. The kingpin of the project, the engineer who had overseen construction, suffered the worst. Some accused him of incompetence, others of corruption. Did he line the channel poorly? Did he pocket funds meant for stone? A few even whispered that he had angered the gods with arrogance. For days he was paraded before tribunals, stammering explanations that convinced no one. He was seen later pacing alone beneath the arches, staring upward as though they mocked him. And still the aqueduct stood magnificent and useless. Its arches framed the sky, its channels gleamed with precise angles, but it carried nothing. Like a harp without strings, it was an instrument mute. Citizens shook their heads as they passed, muttering that beauty without function was a hollow boast. The aqueduct had become a monument not to power but to mystery. That night, under a waning moon, the fountains remained dry. Torches flickered against the stonework, casting shadows that stretched like fingers. Rome's newest wonder had turned overnight into an enigma, and the city would not forget. The story of the aqueduct that ran dry was only beginning. The aqueduct stands in the morning sun, its arches stretching like ribs of some ancient giant laid across the land. Built of stone quarried from hills that echo with centuries of hammer blows, it is both functional and monumental, a reminder that Rome never did anything halfway. Farmers leading donkeys along the path pause to stare upward at the sheer scale of it. Children point to the water that once rushed, gleaming along the channel, though today the flow has dwindled to a trickle that looks more like a damp stain than a stream. The sound is wrong too. Instead of the comforting gurgle of moving water, there is silence broken only by wind whistling through empty conduits. Imagine being one of those villagers used to the aqueduct providing water as faithfully as the sunrise. Suddenly the troughs are dry and the buckets filled from them smell faintly of dust instead of cool freshness. Daily life depends on that flow, cooking, washing and keeping livestock alive. When it falters, it feels as if the earth itself has betrayed them. One mainstream fact worth pausing on here is that Rome engineered aqueducts with remarkable precision, achieving gradients so slight that the water could flow dozens of kilometres without pumps. In some cases, the slope measured less than a finger's width per 100 steps, yet the system worked flawlessly for generations. To see such a marvel falter overnight was almost unthinkable. Soldiers stationed nearby do not laugh at villagers' complaints. They too depend on the aqueduct to keep cisterns full and baths steaming. A legionary who has spent days marching dusty roads cannot easily wash without that channel of water, and let's be honest, the absence of bathing Romans might have caused neighbours to complain even more loudly than the absence of water itself. A quirky tidbit arises here. Romans used not only aqueducts, but also clever lead pipes, and even inverted siphons to channel water uphill into settlements. The loss of pressure in those pipes would have been noticed quickly, and any foul taste or discoloration would have caused alarm, though perhaps not before someone grumbled about the day's stew being spoiled. As word spreads, merchants at the forum speculate in their usual way. Some claim the aqueduct's source was poisoned by rivals, pointing to the long tradition of enemies cutting water supplies to weaken strongholds. Others argue it is simply the gods withdrawing favour, a punishment for pride. Historians still argue whether the initial reactions to such events leaned more towards superstition or engineering curiosity. The reality is that both coexisted. A man might mutter a prayer to Neptune even while measuring the angle of a collapsed stone channel. The governor convenes his council in a hall where maps hang like tapestries, each line showing the reach of Roman control. He drums his fingers on the table as messengers describe villages hauling water by hand from streams, their backs bent, their patience worn thin. Officials murmur about costs, about repairs, about the difficulty of sending labourers up into the mountains when winter closes passes. One clerk even mutters that perhaps the villagers are exaggerating until a jug of dust-filled water is poured out in front of him, silencing the room. The dry aqueduct is no rumour, it is a reality that cannot be ignored. Meanwhile, the aqueduct itself looms as a mute witness. Pigeons roost along its arches, their cooing echoing where water once sang. Grass sprouts between stones, damp no longer washing seeds away. Craftsmen sent to inspect it walk cautiously along the service path, tapping at blocks with hammers searching for cracks or signs of sabotage. They find nothing obvious. The channel is intact, the masonry firm, the gradient true. It is as though the water has simply decided to stop coming like a guest offended and gone without farewell. Night falls and households light oil lamps earlier than usual, because the chores of fetching water from wells and streams take longer than dipping buckets from the aqueduct. Jars line up in courtyards guarded like treasure. Dogs bark at strangers, for in scarcity, every visitor feels like a threat. Markets grumble. Bakers reduce loaves because kneading without sufficient water is impossible, and brewers complain that their vats stand idle. The absence of water is not just an inconvenience, it is a disruption of rhythm, a slow unravelling of the threads that bind daily life. Whispers creep into temples. Priests lead sacrifices, throwing grain onto altars and sprinkling wine in the dust, as if to coax the gods back into generosity. A few men glance nervously toward the governor's palace, wondering if he has offended heaven. Others tell stories of springs that ran dry in distant provinces just before earthquakes or invasions. Fear turns memory selective. Every tale that fits the mood is resurrected, every coincidence polished into an omen. Humour thin though it is, still makes an appearance. A soldier at the barracks cracks that if Mars wants them to fight without water, perhaps he should provide wine instead. The jest earns tired laughter, the kind that hides real worry. In the days that follow, rumours swell like a tide. Some claim to have seen strangers tampering at the source in the hills. Others insist a great beast lies across the spring, its bulk blocking the flow. Children repeat stories of a serpent that drinks rivers whole, its belly so swollen it glows under the moonlight. The more sensible voices are drowned out by the dramatic, because fear always prefers spectacle to reason. The aqueduct stands silent through it all, the greatest piece of Roman engineering in the region, suddenly a riddle no one can solve. And so the mystery deepens. Rome, proud master of stone and water, is brought to an uncomfortable pause. The empire thrives on order, on the idea that everything can be catalogued, counted and commanded. Yet here stands an aqueduct that defies both calculation and command, turning daily life into confusion, and leaving behind only questions. They sit hunched over the scrolls, candlelight dripping wax like tears onto the stone desk. By now the strange silence around the aqueduct has settled into every corner of the city. In normal times the chatter of fountains would echo from courtyards, and the steady murmur of running water would underlay the rhythm of daily life like background music you barely notice until it is gone. But here in the echoing scriptorium of the water records, the only sound is scratching stylus against parchment, and the weary sighs of clerks who know they are expected to explain the unexplainable. It is not a comfortable task. Rome prides itself on order, and water is the lifeblood of that order. If the pipes and channels falter, so too does the image of control. The lead scribe, a man with thinning hair and an indigo robe stained at the cuffs, with ink unrolls a wax tablet and frowns at the figures scratched across its surface. Deliveries from mountain springs are recorded to the last amphora receipts, stamped with seals, measurements logged with almost obsessive neatness. Yet in the final column, the numbers simply fall silent. There is no mark for the water that should have arrived on the previous night, no acknowledgement of interruption, only absence. He chews the end of his stylus as though gnawing might conjure a missing entry. Nearby, a younger clerk mutters that maybe the courier forgot to write it down, but even he doesn't believe it. Roman record keepers forget birthdays' names, even the odd temple donation, but not water. A mainstream fact offers context here. The Romans built a vast and sophisticated bureaucracy around their aqueducts with inspectors called curatores aquarum, whose entire career revolved around making sure every drop was accounted for. Their reports filled archives, and their reputations depended on accuracy. To have no entry at all was like leaving a ledger of taxes with an empty page. It simply did not happen. That's why the silence of the record was louder than any complaint. As they puzzle over numbers, theories bubble up. One suggests an earthquake shook the mountains, diverting the spring overnight. Rome has known tremors before, and water can shift like a nervous animal when the earth growls. Another argues that sabotage is more likely, that perhaps enemies of the city crept into the hills and blocked the flow with rubble or poison. The idea earns scoffs, but only half-hearted ones. After all, it wouldn't be the first time politics reached as far as the pipes. Someone once carved graffiti accusing a rival faction of stealing water, like thieves steal figs. Yes, that was considered a serious insult, and yes, someone probably lost friends over it. The scribes, though, cannot rely on speculation. They try to reconstruct the path of the aqueduct tracing lines on their maps by torchlight. From the high springs in the Sabine Hills, the channels descend across valleys on tall arches, cross ridges through cut stone tunnels, and finally enter the city where fountains, baths, and households draw their share. If the problem is natural, it must lie at the source. If it is human, it could be anywhere along that fragile ribbon of engineering. Either way, the city thirsts while they theorise. A quirky tidbit emerges from the notes. One clerk recalls that a farmer near Tivoli once complained that his sheep grew restless whenever inspectors came to measure the springs. He swore the animals could sense tampering long before men could. The record of his complaint, long forgotten, suddenly looks less amusing in light of this sudden drought. Joking about sheep predicting water loss seems far less funny when Rome's fountains are bone dry. Still, someone chuckles nervously, muttering that perhaps the sheep should be hired as official inspectors. The laugh dies quickly like a candlewick drowning in wax. Meanwhile, the politics sharpen. Word filters down from higher offices. The emperor himself has heard of the problem. That alone makes the scribes sweat harder, for no one wants to admit ignorance before the imperial gaze. To soften their report, they pad it with circumstantial observations, unseasonal mist in the valleys, farmers whispering of omens, an owl heard 3 nights running. It is a bureaucrat's trick, really. When you cannot explain, you overwhelm with irrelevant details. But the silence in the numbers remains unfilled. Historians still argue whether these missing records were deliberate omissions lost through time, or evidence of something genuinely unusual. Some insist that bureaucrats may have destroyed the damning pages themselves to avoid punishment, leaving later generations only gaps to puzzle over. Others believe the pages we have are faithful, which makes the absence all the more unsettling. Was the aqueduct's silence so total that even the ink refused to flow, or is that just a bit of dramatic license whispered through centuries of retelling? The debate hums on like a broken fountain that refuses to quit dripping. The scribe's chamber grows hotter as the day lengthens, wax tablets softening tempers fraying. One clerk slams his stylus down and mutters that the gods must be mocking them, that they who are tasked with recording facts are being asked to document a mystery instead. His neighbour snaps that Rome has survived worse plagues, fires, invasions. Surely a missing stream of water won't sink the empire. Yet the nervous glances around the table betray their unease. Rome survives on appearances, and the appearance of control is slipping through their fingers like water through an unsealed pipe. As dusk creeps in, they prepare their final draft for the magistrates. The summary is short, evasive, and unsatisfying. Flow interrupted. Cause unknown. Investigation required. They seal it with wax and pass it to a messenger who rides out into the dark torch, flickering like a fragile hope. The scribes watch him leave, then slump against the benches. For all their effort, they know they have delivered nothing but questions. And in the silence that follows, one can almost hear the ghost of running water mocking them with its absence. The aqueduct stretches onward, climbing low ridges and threading across shallow valleys, its arches stepping in rhythm like the bones of some great skeleton laid bare to the sun. Villagers from nearby farms pause their work to watch the endless line of stone stride past their fields. They point, they whisper, they argue about the cost, and they wonder aloud if the gods themselves approve. Children chase one another in its shadow, their bare feet kicking up dust, while shepherds sit on hillsides and debate whether water flowing through the sky is a miracle or a dangerous provocation. The project is not simply an engineering feat. It is theatre, a performance of power that demands an audience whether or not the audience wants to clap. Stone by stone, the channel climbs higher, a steady march of labourers straining with ropes and wooden cranes. The rhythm of hammers and chisels echoes through valleys, mingling with birdsong, and the rustle of wind through cypress groves. One mainstream fact to keep in mind is that Rome's engineers often worked with gradients so slight, sometimes only a few centimetres per kilometre, that a casual observer would think the water could never flow at all. Yet it did, gliding smoothly down those long and gentle slopes, an invisible victory of mathematics hidden in plain sight. A quirky rumour clings to this aqueduct's rising walls. Some say the first trickles of water would be reserved not for thirsty workers or farmers, but for the emperor's favourite racehorses, pampered beasts stabled in marble stalls. It may be nonsense, but the image of a sweating legionary filling a golden bucket for a horse, while he himself drinks stale beer, is the kind of story that refuses to die. Historians still argue whether Roman propaganda encouraged such myths, or whether common folk invented them as a safe way to poke fun at their rulers. Either way, the legend travels faster than the aqueduct itself passed along the road with every cart and caravan. As months blend into years, the landscape changes around the project. Forests are cut back to feed kilns, rivers yield up their gravel, and limestone quarries gape like wounds in the earth. Farmers grumble that the land looks stripped, but traders rub their hands at the wealth of contracts pouring from the city. Teams of oxen haul stone blocks polished almost too smooth for their rustic carts, and innkeepers along the route suddenly find themselves busy with engineers, scribes and foremen. The aqueduct does not simply carry water, it carries an entire economy in its wake, each drop still far from Rome, yet already watering pockets. The people working closest to the stones grow superstitious. One mason insists he saw a raven perch on the half-built arch, croaking like a prophet of doom. Another swears that when he swung, his hammer sparks spelled out the shape of Neptune's trident. Laughter follows, but in a nervous sideways sort of way. The line between omen and joke is thin in a world where gods are thought to walk disguised among men. A foreman, red-faced and weary, tries to stamp out such chatter by quoting the official project schedule, but his voice is drowned by the groan of ropes and the creak of cranes. The stones rise whether omens approve or not. The aqueduct's fame spreads outward. In a nearby village, an old woman insists the work is cursed because the builders dug through a burial ground. She throws salt over her shoulder and warns her grandchildren not to walk beneath the arches. In a tavern, a soldier brags that he saw engineers measuring shadows with rods, claiming they can read the sun like a scroll. His companions laugh, claiming that if men could read shadows, they'd be rich already. The humour is rough, the ale rougher, but the story travels on. And as so often happens, the details swell in retelling, until the aqueduct sounds less like a channel for water and more like a ladder to heaven. On the ground, the labour remains stubbornly earthly. Men strain to lift blocks that weigh as much as oxen, their muscles trembling, their shoulders grooved with rope burns. They joke because even exhausted men will joke that the stones are lighter after wine, though of course that is only because wine makes them too dizzy to notice. A legionary mutters that if Rome builds one more aqueduct, they will need to draft Neptune himself into service. The laughter that follows is short, but it is laughter, and in such work, laughter is a kind of mortar that keeps spirits from crumbling. Meanwhile, the engineers guard their calculations like treasure. One misstep, one slope too steep or too flat, and water will rebel, pooling where it should not or refusing to flow at all. They carry tablets scratched with figures, lines and symbols that look like nonsense to the illiterate labourers, but hold the power to guide rivers. Historians still debate how much of this knowledge was native Roman, and how much was borrowed from earlier civilizations, the Greeks, the Etruscans, even the Persians. What matters is not the origin, but the precision, the way a tiny fraction of gradient could decide whether Rome drinks or Rome thirsts. At night, campfires flicker near the construction site. Workers sit cross-legged, gnawing bread hardened by dust, telling stories of cities they have never seen and rivers they may never reach. One man insists he heard of a spring that flows backward uphill as if mocking every engineer alive. Another describes a city where wells bubble with wine, and everyone drinks until they forget to argue. The stories are absurd, but they soften the edges of exhaustion. In the glow of firelight, the arches behind them look less like stone and more like skeletons rising from the earth waiting for flesh. The aqueduct grows arch by arch until it begins to resemble a marching column frozen in stone. Villagers start to look at it differently, less like a nuisance and more like a monument. Children dare one another to run under the arches without stopping pretending the gods will snatch them if they hesitate. Farmers time their sowing to the shadow it casts, claiming the stone's length, can tell seasons as well as the sky. Even without water, the aqueduct has already reshaped the rhythm of life. One morning as the sun rises blood orange through the haze of smoke, the workers set the final keystone in an arch. Cheers erupt, tools clatter to the ground, and men embrace in dust-streaked joy. Someone produces a wineskin, someone else a drum, and for a brief moment the building site becomes a festival. The aqueduct has not yet carried a single drop of water, but already it carries pride proof that men with bare hands and battered tools can coax permanence from stubborn stone. Of course, beneath the cheers runs the quiet knowledge that this is only the skeleton. The real test will come when water is introduced, when the invisible force of gravity decides whether to honour or mock their work. Some whisper prayers to Neptune, others to Jupiter, and a few simply cross themselves in the Christian fashion, hedging their bets. Even in triumph, unease flickers like the torchlight on the arches. The aqueduct is almost alive now, waiting for the pulse of water to animate its veins. By the time the aqueduct's silence reaches the ears of Rome itself, the mood is half disbelief and half irritation. Water shortages in the capital are usually the stuff of summer gossip, the kind of chatter that fuels arguments in bathhouses about whether the pipes need better maintenance or whether the gods have grown stingy again. But this case is different. Messengers stumble through the forum, their tunics still damp from rain on the road, declaring that one of the empire's grand arteries has gone dry in a single night. Senators blink, scribes scratch down notes, and shopkeepers pause mid-sale to gape. Rome is no stranger to drama, but even here, the image of a whole aqueduct suddenly failing feels more like a parable than a piece of plumbing. A mainstream fact puts this into context at its peak. Rome's aqueduct system delivered hundreds of millions of gallons of water each day, feeding fountains, baths, gardens, and private homes. Losing even one aqueduct could throw entire districts into chaos, and that chaos spreads quickly the way spilled wine runs between tiles. Imagine trying to tell a crowd of Romans that their daily bath ritual might be postponed. It would be like telling a modern city that coffee machines are out of service indefinitely. The uproar echoes across marble courtyards and shaded porticos, with every retelling making the disaster sound stranger. The Senate, ever fond of appearing in control, convenes an emergency session. White togas swish across the curia as men argue under painted ceilings, voices bouncing like dice against wood. Some call for immediate engineers to be dispatched with chains, picks and measuring rods. Others insist the matter be left to augurs, claiming that if the water withdrew overnight, it must be a divine message. Historians still argue whether Roman leaders leaned more heavily on science or superstition in such moments. The truth, as usual, is likely a blend of both. An aqueduct is stone and mortar, yes, but it is also a symbol, and symbols rarely suffer silence without someone searching for omens. Meanwhile, in the bustling streets, rumour breeds like rabbits. One fishmonger declares the aqueduct collapsed under its own weight, crushed by years of neglect. A baker insists he saw a caravan of wagons carrying stones away in the night, perhaps stolen for private villas. Children claim that nymphs angered by some forgotten insult fled the channel and took the water with them. A quirky tidbit preserved in later sources suggests that Romans often explained sudden environmental changes by blaming river spirits or mountain gods, a worldview where nature was not passive but opinionated. In this case, the aqueduct's failure becomes a stage for every myth Rome has ever half believed. At the baths of Caracalla, the mood is especially sour. Citizens arrive expecting the usual steamy comfort, only to find pools half empty and attendants shrugging helplessly. Some mutter that without their daily soak, Rome itself will crumble faster than marble in acid rain. Others treat it like a joke. If the water has run away, perhaps it has gone to Alexandria for a holiday. The laughter is nervous brittle, but it offers a moment of release. After all, even in crisis, Romans are rarely too busy to craft a punchline. Back in the Senate, engineers finally get the nod. Surveyors and masons gather tools and prepare to trace the aqueduct stone by stone, hoping to discover whether the problem lies in blockage collapse or something stranger. They march out under the gaze of a restless crowd, their footsteps echoing like a drumbeat of expectation. Behind them, priests prepare incense, just in case the problem proves more divine than material. Rome covers all its bases, pickaxes for the earth, prayers for the heavens. As night falls, torches flicker along the aqueduct's arches, casting long shadows across fields. The engineers mutter measurements, their wax tablets filling with numbers that will later look more like spells than mathematics. Citizens gather on ridges, whispering, pointing, arguing. For many, the aqueduct is more than infrastructure. It is a living vein of the city, and its silence feels like a skipped heartbeat. By torchlight, the mystery deepens, for the stones remain intact. The arches stand firm, and yet the water refuses to return. It is not broken, not visibly anyway. It is simply gone. The scholars of later centuries love this paradox. They write with careful pens about the night Rome discovered absence can be louder than presence. They quote fragments of poets who describe the aqueduct's emptiness as though it were a desert in Midtown. They debate endlessly, was this failure, an engineering oversight, an accident of geology, or a story inflated by chroniclers eager for drama. Historians still argue whether the silence that spread from the aqueduct was more physical or psychological, whether the real shortage lay in water or in trust. Meanwhile, the city adapts in its usual pragmatic way. Wells are tapped, rainwater, collected cisterns drained. Markets bustle with higher prices as water becomes coin, and complaints double as entertainment. Yet under the surface of jokes and improvisations lies unease, a creeping sense that Rome's vaunted mastery of nature might not be as permanent as marble inscriptions claim. A crack has appeared not in stone but in confidence, and so close is with Rome holding its breath waiting for either water or explanation to return. The aqueduct, that elegant scar of stone across the hills, remains silent, its arches glowing faintly in moonlight like the ribs of some slumbering beast. The city whispers, wonders, laughs nervously, and debates fiercely, but answers like water remain elusive, leaving only thirst and speculation. The aqueduct sits silent now, a spine of stone arches cutting across the landscape like the ribs of some ancient beast, its channels empty, its purpose betrayed. The Romans had always thought of these structures not simply as plumbing, but as the lifelines of empire veins that carried the lifeblood of water into the heart of cities. When one of them failed, when its channels ran dry in a single night, it was not just an inconvenience, it was an existential crisis. Imagine a modern city suddenly losing power, internet, and running water all at once. The panic, the disbelief, the suspicion would be overwhelming. Now layer in Roman superstition, political rivalry, and a tendency for senators to clutch their pearls whenever omens seemed to stack up. That was the atmosphere when the aqueduct dried. Some citizens swore they had heard it before they saw it, a kind of echoing gasp as if the water itself had been sucked backward into the hills. Others insisted that in the hours leading up to the failure, the flow had run strangely warm as though Vulcan himself had dropped a coal into the channel. And by dawn, when people went to fill buckets, fountains spluttered like dying throats, and baths lay cold, the last dribbles sliding down drains with pitiful gurgles. The empire thrived on ritual bathing, public fountains, private gardens watered with elaborate lead pipes. All of these depended on the constant flow, so the sudden silence of water was like waking up to find the sun had forgotten to rise. Engineers hurried to investigate their wax tablets, filled with quick sketches of channels, sluices, and arcades. Mainstream fact reminds us that Roman aqueducts were marvels of precision, engineered with gradients so shallow that water could glide miles downhill with barely a drop of slope per 100 feet. To see such perfection collapse overnight was shocking. But what they found offered no easy explanation. No landslide blocked the course, no enemy sabotage left smoking ruins, no earthquake cracked the arches. The water had simply stopped. Historians still argue whether the collapse of flow was due to natural causes like a sudden cave-in of a spring source, or whether something more deliberate, perhaps even political, lay behind it. Meanwhile, the mood in the city shifted quickly from curiosity to dread. Rumours fluttered like startled pigeons in the forum. Some whispered that the gods had withdrawn their gift, punishing Rome for arrogance, perhaps for some senator's impiety, or for the emperor's vanity. Others claimed that sorcery was at play, that secret rites in the hills had stolen the waters away, locked them underground with spells muttered by those resentful of Rome's reach. A quirky tidbit emerges here. Some Romans genuinely believed in Defixion's curse tablets that could bind harm or misdirect. These were often thin sheets of lead, inscribed with names and petitions to underworld gods, then folded and nailed before being cast into wells, graves, or rivers. Imagine someone suggesting with a straight face that an aqueduct feeding thousands had been cursed shut by a disgruntled priest with good handwriting and a nail. It sounds absurd, yet it fit neatly into the worldview of people who saw divine will in every raven's flight. The baths, of course, were the first to feel the impact. Public bathhouses were not luxuries. They were social engines where senators, merchants, and commoners alike gathered, where gossip flowed thicker than steam. To close them was to cut off not only hygiene but also the chatter that glued Roman society together. The city suddenly smelled different, less of perfumed oils and warm stone, more of sweat clinging to tunics. People began to point fingers. Bath owners muttered that aqueduct inspectors had been bribed to divert water elsewhere. Inspectors insulted fired back that the owners had overdrawn their allotted supply, leaving the channels gasping. Accusations spread louder each hour until it seemed the water had not only vanished but taken trust with it. Engineers traced the aqueduct's line into the countryside, trudging along the elevated channels, climbing arches, peering into inspection shafts. One team reached the springhead, only to find the source diminished to a trickle. Here debates ignite among modern scholars. Historians still argue whether the aqueduct's spring was temporarily blocked by a landslide, whether underground karst caves collapsed, swallowing the water, or whether the spring itself simply shifted course overnight, a geological quirk that does sometimes occur. But the records of those engineers are maddeningly vague, full of terms like fata maquae, the fate of the water, which feels less like a diagnosis and more like a sigh. Meanwhile, the priests saw opportunity. In the Capitoline Temple, augurs spread out sacred chickens and declared that the gods had sent clear warnings. They urged rituals of atonement, sacrifices, purification rites that involved both incense and, ironically, a lot of water that was no longer available. One cheeky senator joked that perhaps the gods wanted better plumbing contractors, a remark that was not appreciated by the priests. Yet the laughter it sparked, though brief, was a release in a city strung tight with worry. For the ordinary Roman, the sudden dryness was terrifyingly practical. No water for fountains meant trudging farther to wells or cisterns, many of which were quickly overburdened. No water for sewers meant the Cloaca Maxima, the great drain, ran sluggish, carrying more stench than relief. And no water for fields meant that if the problem lasted more than days, not hours, crops around the city would wilt. Rome was a master of conquest and spectacle, but a city of marble is no less thirsty than a village of mud huts. When thirst loomed, all other concerns shrank. The emperor's role in this crisis becomes another knot of speculation. Some accounts suggest he ordered the investigation personally, dispatching officials with seals and soldiers to guard the works. Others insist he avoided mention of it altogether, as if silence could soften the embarrassment. Historians still argue whether this event even made it into the official annals, or whether it was brushed aside, hidden under more flattering reports of victories abroad. The paradox is clear. An event monumental enough to disrupt daily life for thousands might have been too embarrassing to trumpet, leaving us with scattered fragments instead of a neat chronicle. As night fell on that first dry day, the city listened not to the gurgle of fountains but to the groan of uneasy silence. Lamps flickered in taverns where wine replaced water, and mutters turned to speculation. Would the aqueduct return in the morning, a temporary absence like a sulking god who had only stepped away? Or was this the start of something larger, a punishment, a portent, a collapse of the order Rome had built stone by stone? People went to bed uneasy, and many woke in the dark hours to listen for the sound of rushing water in the channels, like children waiting for a parent's step. But the channel stayed quiet. The empire had lost not only water, but also certainty, and in Rome certainty was as vital as bread. The aqueduct that once carried shimmering water now sits strangely silent, a skeleton of stone arches and channels stretching across valleys and ridges. Morning light gilds its edges, but no sparkle of flow glimmers on the surface. For the people who live nearby, the silence is louder than any rushing current. They wake expecting to hear the steady murmur that has always been the background to their lives, the sound of Rome itself channeled through cut rock and vaulted spans. Instead, the air is heavy with absence, the hush like a skipped heartbeat. Men walk to the cisterns, their clay jars in hand, and stare at hollows that should brim with life. One boy tips his jar forward, waiting for water that never arrives, and shakes it as though the problem is in his grip, not the empire's infrastructure. The shock is simple at first, a missing necessity. But beneath it, fear begins to stir, because water is not only comfort, but survival. And Romans do not take lightly the silence of an aqueduct. The first whispers spread quickly, riding on sandals across cobbled streets. Some mutter that the gods have withdrawn their favour, punishing arrogance. Others suggest sabotage, muttering about rival towns upstream who envy Rome's abundance. A few point fingers at foreigners, always a convenient scapegoat when things go wrong, saying that spies must have tampered with the source. It's easier to blame an enemy you can picture than a cause you cannot see. But the most unnerving explanation comes from those who walk the aqueduct line itself. These are the caretakers' men whose job is to patrol the arches, checking mortar and clearing silt. They report no breaks, no collapses, no sign that the system has failed. The channels are intact, the arches still stand proud against the sky, the settling tanks clean enough to reflect torchlight. Everything looks as it always has, except that water no longer runs. One mainstream fact grounds this eerie puzzle. Roman aqueducts were marvels of engineering, often so well constructed that parts of them still stand 2 millennia later. They relied on precise gradients, sometimes falling only a few centimetres per kilometre, to keep water flowing steadily across vast distances. That such a system could simply stop overnight without visible cause runs contrary to everything we know about Roman precision. In normal times, interruptions came from blockages, earthquakes, or deliberate shut-offs during repairs, but here none of those applied. The record, thin as papyrus left in the rain, insists the structure was fine. It was the water itself that was missing, as if the river had decided to reroute in the dead of night. Quirky tidbits begin to colour the retellings. Some insist that the aqueduct had always been haunted, that strange figures were seen walking its length at dusk, their robes fluttering though no wind blew. Children dared each other to climb its steps and peer down into the dark channels, swearing that they heard voices echoing from the stone. One tale even claims that a worker once vanished inside his torchlight, swallowed without a trace, leaving only the sound of dripping water where no one should have been. Of course, this might be the imagination of generations who lived in the shadow of great works they only half understood. But in the light of sudden silence, every old whisper feels like proof. The debates intensify in the forum. Senators ever fond of speeches rise to insist that Rome's might cannot be questioned by something as trivial as plumbing. One man argues that the aqueduct is a symbol of the empire's destiny, and its silence must therefore be an omen, a warning from the gods. Another dismisses this as theatrics, saying, the solution lies in surveying the headwaters. Historians still argue whether the Senate truly dispatched engineers in haste, or whether they dragged their feet, too embarrassed to admit ignorance. Either way, the rumour that politicians bickered while fountains ran dry is one of those details that sounds suspiciously timeless. 2,000 years may pass, but some things never change. Meanwhile, daily life strains under the loss. Bakers who depend on steady flows for mixing dough complain their bread turns hard. Washerwomen who normally scrub linens at communal basins look around helplessly, holding cloth stiff with yesterday's dirt. Even the bathhouses, those social hubs where politics and gossip bubble as hot as the water, close their doors. The absence of baths cuts deeper than hygiene, it cuts into Roman identity. Imagine telling a Roman citizen that they cannot lounge with friends in steaming pools debating gladiator results while being massaged with oils. That's like banning modern folks from their phones. Society doesn't collapse instantly, but everyone feels the absence like an itch they cannot scratch. The streets begin to smell different too. Without steady washing, the dust clings thicker. The refuse lingers longer. The animals leave their marks on stone alleys without swift rinsing. People wrinkle their noses and mutter that the city itself has turned sour, a physical echo of their unease. One old man jokes that perhaps Rome has finally decided to smell like a real city, instead of pretending it is Olympus. The laughter that follows is thin, edged with nerves, but it is laughter nonetheless, a fragile relief in a city waiting for answers. Engineers climb the aqueduct once more, measuring every slope with ropes and weights, tapping the stone with hammers to hear for hollows. They scratch their heads at the perfection. One mutters that the structure is as sound as the day it was built, while another swears the gradient could carry a trickle from here to Carthage if only water would return. They even walk to the source expecting to find a blockage or a landslide. Instead, they find the spring itself diminished, its pool shrunken like a wineskin left in the sun. The reeds bend, dry frogs sit listless in mud, and the trickle that once gushed to fill Rome's fountains dribbles like a cracked amphora. That sight, more than anything, spreads fear. If the gods turned off the tap at the mountain, what could mortal hands do? At night, families huddle in courtyards whispering versions of the day's discoveries. Some claim the mountain was cursed. Others suggest rival priests performed a rite to steal the spring spirit. A few laugh uneasily, insisting it must be a temporary quirk of nature, that tomorrow the water will come back like a sulking child returning after a tantrum. Yet each dawn brings the same silence, the same empty basins, the same dryness clinging to lips and throats. The aqueduct, that proud artery of the empire, has become a hollow bone, clean and strong, but without blood to flow through it. And so Rome waits. The fountains stand like empty bowls, the bathhouses echo with ghosts, the bakeries churn out smaller loaves, and the senators sharpen speeches as if words could conjure rivers. The aqueduct still gleams in the sun, each arch a marvel of geometry, but it carries nothing. The paradox gnaws at every mind. How can perfection stand empty? How can a masterpiece lose its purpose overnight? The question hangs in the smoky air, unresolved, a riddle draped across stone and shadow. The aqueduct that once brought life to Rome and its settlements now lingers in memory like a ghost story told beside a dwindling fire. The pipes remain, the arches still rise over valleys, but the water that once surged through them is gone, as if the earth itself decided to turn off the tap. By now the whispers have shifted from engineering flaws to omens and plots, and the tension inside the city is as heavy as the stones of the aqueduct itself. Every splash of a fountain is measured by anxious ears. Every ripple in a bathhouse pool is studied as if it were a message from the gods. What once was taken for granted, fresh water flowing at all hours, is now fragile, uncertain, like a candle flame in a draughty room. Rome, for all its practicality, is also a city that loves spectacle. When things go wrong, the citizens expect their leaders to explain, or at the very least to put on a performance convincing enough to calm the crowd. In this case, the performance comes in the form of hastily called sacrifices at major temples. Bulls are led through the forum, their hides gleaming russet under the sun, their eyes wide as priests sprinkle them with saffron-tinted water before the killing blow. Incense coils upward, prayers drone, and the air fills with a smell that is part meat, part smoke, part desperation. The mainstream fact here is that Roman religion was deeply tied to statecraft. If the gods frowned, the people blamed leaders, and if the people lost faith, authority cracked faster than a dried aqueduct channel. But not everyone buys the official line. In taverns tucked into the back alleys of Subura, the talk runs sharper than the wine. Some say the emperor himself offended Jupiter by boasting too loudly of Rome's eternal dominion. Others whisper that the Christians, still viewed with suspicion by many, prayed secretly for a sign. And this was their god's reply. There is even a rumour that one senator's slaves were seen carrying strange urns at night, as if pouring something foul into the aqueduct's channels. Historians still argue whether such whispers reflect real sabotage, or simply the human instinct to blame shadowy figures when faced with the inexplicable. Either way, the rumours are sticky and they cling to reputations like damp cloaks. A quirky little tidbit finds its way into the conversation. Some suggest that the aqueduct's water spirits, those guardians believed to dwell in springs and streams, had finally grown weary of being harnessed like oxen. One wag claims that a nymph was spotted sulking near the Tiber, pouting as if to say, "If you want your own river, build it yourself." It is said with a grin, but the joke only half works. When laughter follows, it sounds strained, the kind of laughter people use when they are actually worried. And perhaps they are right to worry. Romans may have been masters of stone and mortar, but they were still deeply superstitious, seeing the hand of the divine in every crack of thunder or sudden change in fortune. The emperor cannot ignore this crisis. He convenes his advisors' men in teal-trimmed togas who smell faintly of perfumed oil and old scrolls. They gather in a chamber hung with maps tracing lines of aqueducts across valleys, counting reservoirs, calculating flow rates. It is less like a council of warriors, and more like an anxious debate among accountants who know that a single miscalculation could topple more than an aqueduct. It could topple faith in imperial power. Voices rise, hands sweep fingers, jab at the maps. One advisor insists the water was diverted by enemies in the hills. Another retorts that no barbarian has the patience for Roman engineering. The emperor drums his fingers on the table, his face a mask of calm, though his thoughts are anything but calm. Outside, the people grow restless. At fountains that once gushed freely, children wait with empty buckets, their bare feet dusty, their eyes wide. Women stand in lines that snake through the streets, whispering prayers and complaints in equal measure. One man, clutching a clay jug, mutters that the aqueduct was cursed from its first stone, and a crowd gathers around him as if his words themselves are water. This is the danger Rome knows too well when belief wavers, order wavers with it. No empire, no matter how strong, can survive if its people stop believing in the stories that hold it together. Meanwhile, artisans and engineers are sent into the countryside to examine the aqueduct's path. They trudge along ridges, peer into tunnels, and lower wicker baskets filled with torches into shafts. Reports trickle back, but none agree. One team swears that an underground spring feeding the aqueduct has shifted course overnight, swallowed by the earth itself. Another insists the channel was deliberately blocked with rubble stones packed so neatly that it must have been done by human hands. Yet another returns empty-handed, claiming they found nothing at all, only silence and dry stone. The paradox builds too many answers, yet no answer. The poets seize upon this uncertainty with relish. One composes verses about how even rivers grow tired of serving men, choosing freedom over slavery. Another writes of betrayal, hinting that Rome's enemies across the frontier have found a way to wound the empire without lifting a sword. The words circulate faster than facts because words are lighter, easier to carry, and far more entertaining to repeat. Soon children chant rhymes in the streets about the aqueduct that ran away, and the humour, though cutting, only makes the mystery deeper. As dusk settles, the city glows with lamplight. The air is thick, still heavy with incense from the sacrifices still humming, with the rumours from taverns. Somewhere a senator scribbles on a wax tablet, recording his own version of events, one that may or may not survive to be read centuries later. Somewhere else a farmer sharpening his scythe mutters that Rome's glory is fading as even water refuses to flow for them. The aqueduct stands silent outside the city walls, arches dark against the sky like a ribcage with no breath. And though officials promise answers, what lingers in the air is not confidence but dread. the silence of water has become louder than its roar. The aqueduct that had once been Rome's pride now lingered in memory like a rumour that refused to fade. When a structure so vast, so visible and so practical simply ceased to function, the silence it left behind was louder than the rush of any water. Generations later, people still told stories about the day it ran dry overnight. Each retelling polished the tale until it gleamed with mystery, though the edges of fact and fable blurred into one another. The city that thrived on bread circuses and constant supplies of water carried the memory of absence as keenly as it carried the triumph of abundance. Archaeologists today still walk those same stretches of stone, tracing the arches that survive, watching sparrows dart between weathered blocks. The aqueducts remain among the most iconic features of Rome's engineering. One mainstream fact is that the system as a whole stretched more than 400 kilometres, about 250 miles by the empire's peak, feeding fountains, baths, latrines and private homes. The vanished aqueduct, therefore, is not only a curiosity, it is a rupture in a network that was otherwise relentless in its efficiency. To study it now is to study a missing piece, a puzzle that sits out of place in a world that usually prided itself on straight lines and steady flow. Theories still branch out like tributaries from a river. Some modern engineers argue that a sudden landslide or earthquake diverted the source, overnight cutting supply at the mountain spring. Others point to sabotage rivals or rebellious locals might have blocked the channel or smashed a critical bridge. Historians still argue whether the disappearance reflects a natural event, a political manoeuvre, or something stranger, an accident that no one ever confessed. The ambiguity is what gives the story its grip. For every tidy explanation, there is another that resists closure. The ruins themselves whisper contradictions. Excavations have revealed lime deposits in channels that end abruptly, as though water stopped one evening while still mid-flow. At the same time, storage cisterns nearby show signs of having been full long after the channel fell silent, suggesting reserves lasted longer than the aqueduct itself. These physical traces read like marginal notes in a manuscript helpful but incomplete. They leave more questions than answers. Even the tools abandoned in maintenance chambers hint at confusion chisels, left mid-stroke brushes hardened with dust. A system that had required constant vigilance simply ceased to be watched. Quirky traditions emerged in local folklore. One tale claimed that the aqueduct's water spirit had grown offended, withdrawing its gift when Rome failed to honour it with offerings. In some villages, farmers poured small libations of wine into streams, murmuring apologies on behalf of the city. Another story insisted that Christian prayers had silenced a pagan channel, redirecting water toward holier ground. Whether these ideas were poetic invention or genuine belief, they coloured the way later generations remembered the disappearance. Water was not only plumbing, it was personality, a presence that could be pleased or displeased. Imagine the way this absence echoed through daily life. Bathhouses once steamed with chatter and gossip, but their pools grew tepid, drained or closed altogether. Women who carried amphorae to fountains found them dry, their gossip replaced with anxious silence. Bakers who relied on steady water to knead dough worried about how to meet quotas of bread owed to the city's grain dole. A quirky aside from Roman satire even joked that senators became dirtier and crankier without their midday baths, suggesting politics itself suffered when aqueducts faltered. The humour, though light, reflects the central role of water in everything from hygiene to diplomacy. In the absence of certainty, poets and writers filled the void. Some framed the dry aqueduct as an omen, a warning that Rome had overreached. Others presented it as divine punishment for corruption or excess. A few chroniclers hardly mentioned it, as though silence could erase embarrassment. The fact that accounts differ so wildly underscores how unsettling the event was. Rome was accustomed to recording victories, not mysteries. The lack of resolution gave later storytellers fertile ground like soil that sprouts weeds as easily as wheat. Modern visitors who stand among the arches may not hear water, but they can still feel the weight of mystery. The stones are laced with moss, their outlines softened by centuries of weather. Yet they remain upright, insistent reminders of human ambition. Tour guides often mention the vanished aqueduct with a shrug, unable to say more than it dried up overnight. That shrug is telling. After 2,000 years, the event still resists neat packaging. And in that resistance, the aqueduct's story continues to flow, not through channels of stone, but through channels of curiosity. Some scholars even argue that the disappearance is less important than the endurance of the story itself. Why do people remember the aqueduct that failed more vividly than the dozens that succeeded? Perhaps because humans are wired to notice absence more than presence. A flowing channel is expected. A sudden silence sticks. It is the same reason we remember the one feast that turned deadly, the one general who vanished without trace, the one aqueduct that went dry while others carried on. The mystery is not only about water, it is about memory, and so the tale drifts into legend. Children once asked their elders why the arches stood empty, and elders answered with guesses that grew into traditions. Scholars scribbled in margins, engineers sighed at the lack of data, poets sighed more beautifully at the lack of certainty. The aqueduct that ran dry overnight may never have its explanation pinned like a butterfly to a board, but perhaps that is why it matters. Because water, like memory, is always moving, and sometimes the gaps tell the story better than the flow itself. The night is long, but dawn insists on its return. A pale wash of light presses through the cracks in the Roman brickwork, falling on men whose eyes are swollen with exhaustion and whose lips are parched from whispering theories until no more words remain. The aqueduct, once a roaring artery of stone and water, remains silent. No trickle, no glimmer, no sigh of current against moss-worn channels. It is as though the earth itself has swallowed the river whole, leaving behind nothing but emptiness, and 1,000 explanations stacked like amphorae in a warehouse, none of them complete. The silence hums louder than a flood ever could, and the absence weighs on every soul who has watched Rome bend nature, and now seen nature bend back. What follows is a contest not of engineering, but of story. Engineers insist it must have been a hidden fault line, an underground shift that cracked the conduit. Priests raise their hands toward the sky and say the gods simply withdrew their favour. A celestial shrug that drained the veins of the empire. Soldiers mutter about sabotage of enemies slipping into tunnels at night with tools sharp as betrayal. Merchants less poetic complain that without water the baths cool, the fountains sputter and the markets lose their customers. The city's rhythm falters. To understand how deeply water was woven into Roman life is to understand why this vanishing struck so cruelly. Aqueducts did not only quench thirst, they symbolized Rome's ability to tame rivers and mountains. Their dry arches now seem like ribs stripped of flesh. A mainstream fact echoes here. By the height of the empire, Rome commanded 11 separate aqueduct lines, delivering hundreds of millions of gallons of water every day to fountains, baths, private homes and gardens. Their combined length stretched for hundreds of kilometres, nearly 250 miles, and they remain among the most ambitious feats of ancient engineering. That Rome could carry rivers across valleys on tiers of stone, and yet one morning wake to find a channel bone dry is a paradox too sharp to ignore. Among the whispers is a quirkier strand, a tale told by one traveller who claimed to have seen fish stranded in the dust of the channel, their silver scales dull and dry, flapping briefly before stillness overtook them. Another swore he saw frogs leap desperately from hollow pipes, scattering into courtyards like tiny refugees. Whether truth or embroidery, such images spread like wildfire because people love details that sting. They imagine the impossible and believe it twice as hard. After all, who would remember a plain sentence, the aqueduct failed, when they could picture a carp lying helpless on a stone trough? Historians still argue whether the aqueduct's silence lasted hours, days, or longer. Some sources suggest repairs were swift, that within a week water gushed again, and Romans went back to gossiping about gladiators. Others hint at a gap of months, long enough for desperation to creep into neighbourhoods, for wells to be dug frantically, for buckets to clatter at the Tiber's edge in numbers not seen for generations. Still others suspect the silence never fully ended, that pressure was lower, that the flow faltered, that Rome never trusted its water quite the same again. The absence is magnified by its uncertainty. For the men who carried the rumour, the story does not end at the aqueduct's arches. Traders carry it to the next town where the tale already wears new colours. The emperor himself had offended the gods, they say, and the aqueduct dried as punishment. Sailors carry it across the sea, where listeners imagine Rome crumbling because one waterway deserted her. A poet scribbles lines about thirsty marble lions at fountains, their mouths open, but dry statues weeping dust instead of water. Humour and horror mingle because when you cannot explain something, you can at least describe it beautifully. The commander assigned to oversee order in the city writes nothing official. He knows that parchment can outlive men, and some silences are better than recorded shame. Instead, he keeps the soldiers marching, keeping the forums calm, dispersing the angriest citizens before their voices swell into riot. He reminds them that Rome has survived worse fires, invasions, earthquakes, and will survive this. But his own eyes flick nervously to the dry arches each time he passes them, as though expecting them to collapse in on his certainty. He may not record words, but his silence is itself a record, one historians centuries later puzzle over like a half-burned scroll. And still, the aqueduct looms in memory. Centuries later, archaeologists sift through stonework tracing mortar seams, noting places where water once carved grooves into the floor. They find repair patches layered over repair patches, signs of constant vigilance, constant worry. They uncover coins dropped in channels, perhaps thrown as offerings, perhaps lost during frantic work. Each discovery underlines the same contradiction: an aqueduct strong enough to outlast empires, yet fragile enough to vanish overnight. The riddle never finds a single solution. The tale endures because it sits at the crossroads of engineering and myth, of stone and superstition. Did Rome lose water to sabotage accident or divine will? No answer stands unchallenged. But the story, like the arches themselves, holds. People remember not certainty, but mystery. They remember a city waking to silence where once was thunder, a reminder that even the mightiest power can be undone in a single night without warning. And now, as the narrative softens, let the listener ease away from the tension. The torches gutter the arches, fade into dawn, and the story curls into its own shadow. What remains is not thirst, but wonder, the kind that settles gently instead of striking sharply. Let the pace slow now, like water finding its own calm level. The arches of the aqueduct stand quiet, their stones glowing in the soft light of a setting sun. You do not need to solve their riddle. You only need to rest beside it. Imagine the silence of the channel not as loss, but as stillness. A pool where your own thoughts can settle. Breathe slowly. Each breath is like a ripple spreading across a pond, gentle and even. The noise of debate, the voices of scholars, the shouts of angry crowds, all of it falls away. What remains is the enduring shape of stone, patient and steady watching. Centuries pass without hurry. Lift your gaze upward. The same stars that looked down on Roman arches now shine above you. Their light has crossed ages without dimming. They are not asking you for answers, not demanding explanations. They are simply present, offering their calm, offering their rhythm. Let your shoulders soften. Let the weight slip from your chest. The aqueduct's silence is not frightening here. It is soothing, a reminder that not every mystery must be solved. Not every puzzle must press against your mind. Some can rest, and so can you. Close your eyes. The arches remain, the stars remain, and your breath remains. Everything else can fade. Drift now into sleep, carrying not the thirst of unanswered questions, but the gentle comfort of knowing that history itself hums like a lullaby when allowed to rest.